this brochure, this analysis that was conducted, struck me as a piece of propaganda that was designed, written with the objective of convincing American soldiers that Russian soldiers and the Russian government and the Russian military under Vladimir Putin was an impending threat to the American military. And the next stage of that appearance, that engagement, would be Ukraine. And would be Russian forces that are already in Ukraine engaging American forces, and as well as Syria. So when I read this report, I looked at it from a psychological operations officer perspective. I looked at it from, well, what are they saying and what are they not saying? And oftentimes it's more important what they don't say, what they don't include, to discover what the truth is behind this. And this report essentially tries to inform, persuade, and influence the American soldier to believe that Russian military, Spetsnaz, Special Operations Forces, engaged in an overthrow of the Ukrainian government, and the Ukrainian government being pro-European, and the United States having to step in and be a presence to preserve the Ukrainian government in their pursuit of, you know, freedom, liberty, happiness. And that essentially neglects to inform the American soldier about the real occurrences that happened in Ukraine that are the sole responsibility of the Obama administration and the State Department and the CIA under Victoria Nuland and Senator Hillary Clinton and later John Kerry. And specifically, what is neglected in the report is that the United States under Victoria Nuland and the State Department orchestrated a coup d'etat against the Ukrainian government using snipers and various other components of weaponry, and essentially removed the Ukrainian president and tried to set up a pro-Europe, a pro-American government there. All of that is neglected in the report. And that is, to me, a sign that the American government under the Obama administration wrote this report a year or so ago, before President Trump was ever elected. And this has all of the markings of an Obama military, CIA, State Department analysis to try and set the stage for a future war engagement between the United States and Ukraine. So this is not a Trump doctrine. This is not a current military doctrine. This is a report that no doubt took 2 years to write, as the procedures and protocols are in the military. It takes a long time. So this report struck me as an Obama report that was designed to be propaganda against our own American soldiers, to convince them that the Russians are the enemy, the Russians have technology they're going to use against us, they've been engaged in Ukraine, and Ukraine is our learning crucible to compare American combat technology and strategies with the Russians in order to prepare for an inevitable conflict. So it struck me as the Obama administration preparing for war against Russia, being influenced by the deep state actors in the military-industrial complex and NATO and the Pentagon. So it seems to be more propaganda than truth. Well, this report essentially compared the Russian tanks, the Russian snipers, the Russian drones, the Russian artillery, the Russian soldier, compared them to the United States in a very general, generic, sort of broad stroke way. And they didn't get into the technical expertise. They simply identified the photographs of the tank and the ability of its guns and its speed and the amount of weapon rounds that it can hold and such. But that really wasn't too much of a disclosure of the comparison of the US versus Russian. I mean, frankly, I think the Russians have outstanding technology. They are the ones who essentially have the cyber operation technology and the electronic warfare to wipe out the Navy Aegis radar systems of the ships, which we recall in the episode of the USS Donald Cook resulted in a Russian flyby that crippled a Navy destroyer's ability to engage in any combat. And I think the other current episodes revolving around the USS John McCain and the USS Fitzgerald, which occurred in the Pacific in the Indian Ocean over the last month or so, is an indication of US cyber inferiority to some of the Russian capabilities. That being said, this report did not focus on the inferiority of Russia in its air systems, perhaps. It simply started to try and drum up a general foundation for Russia is practicing its war maneuvers in Ukraine, it's practicing and perfecting its strategies and its exercises and its coordination in Syria, and the United States needs to be prepared and analyze those actions, analyze those tactics, because the next inevitable war is going to be between Russia and the United States. Now, I don't believe that. I think that's a very silly and shallow military assessment and an intelligence assessment, because in the theaters of Ukraine, Russia was not engaging in an aggressive attack on the Ukrainian government. Instead, the Russians were responding to an attack that was orchestrated by John Kerry, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Victoria Nuland, the CIA, the State Department, and certain elements of the U.S. military, to overthrow the sovereign government of Ukraine and the sovereign president and replace him with specific U.S. puppets and NATO and European puppet regime personalities, which were incidentally very Nazi-oriented, very harsh right-wing, and we've seen videos of them tossing Ukrainian politicians into dumpsters, lighting buildings on fire. Of course, the snipers that were present in the Ukrainian city were CIA, State Department contractors. So Russia was responding to an aggressive military move that was being pushed by Obama and his deep state, his CIA, his State Department, and not an offensive invasion. And that's quite different. So President Putin and the Russians were responding to Donetsk being persecuted, and Crimea's political reabsorption with Russia really is a manifestation of the indigenous people having a closer affection and bond with Russia based on their history and culture, and their fear of being persecuted and killed by the new Nazi regime that was instituted by the United States and by Europe and by Victoria Nuland. So that's the background for the conflict in Ukraine, but this report neglects that. This report doesn't analyze any of the information operations, any of the motivations behind the Russians or President Putin. It fails to identify what really the truth was, and that's what stunk most about this report. This was pure propaganda. It labeled the classical American propaganda slogans of 9/11 and the War on Terror, which have been subsequently proven to be a false flag attack that the United States and Israel's Mossad and the CIA inflicted on itself, destroying the buildings from within using nuclear and thermite devices, attacking the Pentagon with a drone and a missile, not a plane. And I was there at the Pentagon and drove by the next day and saw the hole, and there was no plane. So the artificiality and the false flag attack that was used by American military and government agents with the Israeli Mossad documenting the event, that was the greatest war crime in the history of civilization against America, and it was done by our own government. I came to that realization much, much later, having worked with a top secret clearance and been working at the State Department and working in Special Operations Command in Washington, D.C., and meeting a lot of the people who knew about this and reported it. I discovered it much later, and I was so deeply offended that I channeled a report about this up to the American Congress and the military, and subsequently I was imprisoned for it. So my experience with the military and the American government is that when you speak truth and you expose the lies of 9/11 and this war on terror, which is now trying to unfold Iran and Syria and Russia and Ukraine, the world needs to know the truth so that these lies and these false flag attacks cannot expand into a more global thermonuclear conflict, as we see dangerously close to the Korean episode and the Syrian episode.
But if you believe what is right, and it turns out that even American specialists in Russia understand our country very badly?
Well, I think that's a tragedy that the United States does misunderstand Russia very, very badly. The American intelligence community, the American psychological warfare community, the American State Department community has a sad contempt and a disregard and a arrogance towards Russia that is based entirely on Soviet Cold War prejudices that no longer exist. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. Russia exists. The Soviet Union government, military doesn't exist. The Russian Orthodox people, led by President Vladimir Putin, is a new nation and a new people and a new culture with ancient historical traditions and ties, but it is not the Soviet communist menace that the U.S. Claims to have been in a life and death struggle during the Cold War. But yet, the American military and the American State Department and the CIA are obsessed with trying to resurrect this Cold War menace to justify endless military-industrial complex budgets and operations and wars. And the sad thing is that gets Americans killed. It gets innocent people killed. And Russia knows that. Russia has seen its borders around its former republics shrink under the Reagan administration and President Gorbachev. The promise, the agreement was NATO would not expand towards Russia, and Russia would step down and diminish in its military capacity. And here, after Ronald Reagan, the opposite was true. Under George Bush and subsequent American presidents, NATO has expanded violently without any respect towards the Russian integrity of their geography, of their country, and that has caused the encirclement of Russia with U.S. military missiles and Navy ships and bases all over the world. So Russia is responding in a defensive posture, not an offensive posture, yet this report in the American military doctrine continuously tries to define Russia as pursuing empirical agendas, trying to expand its territory, trying to expand and resurrect its Soviet empire, which is all nonsense. So the other thing, of course, is Russia fails to understand America. Specifically, in the psychological warfare information operations dimension, the Russians fail to understand that America and American culture and American men and women in military for the past 20 years have been subjected to some of the most debilitating and destructive educational programs and cultural programs and entertainment in the history of humanity. And it has caused a very unstable American citizen. For example, you have a culture of young people between 18 and 35 that are covered with tattoos, covered with piercings, have engaged in a transgender, homosexual self-redefinition, which is very destructive to the core of a person. Their core is defined by their sexuality, their sense of being a man or a woman, a warrior or a soldier, a leader. But in today's American society, political correctness has become the new religion, and causing offense by having an opinion that is rooted on biological truth or anything of a conservative religious character is seen by the American liberal media and the American culture as very acidic, antagonistic, and violent, and that's why you have the anti-fascist movement in America. You have a group in America that is very violent, very fascist in fact, tearing down statues and trying to gut the core, pull out the heart of America. Well, that same population exists in the American military. So Russia needs to understand that the American soldier, the American military, are afflicted with contradictions, with psychological debilitation, with moral emptiness. There is no clear, strong character that existed in the American soldier that existed 25, 30, 40 years ago. It has now become a hermaphrodite, transgender, homosexual, lesbian military with political correctness, transgender sexual reassignment surgery. All of that I wrote a report on when I was in the Army, saying if these policies are pursued by the Obama administration, it will gut and destroy the American moral character, and all of the best soldiers will leave the United States military, and its combat effectiveness will be severely hampered and damaged. And we will also be broadcasting to the rest of the world, specifically some of the more conservative Islamic nations, that we are a nation that is seeking to push transgenderism, homosexuality, rabid, violent feminist political actions, and all sorts of perversions and corruptions that have come out of the American compromise, the American liberalism. This will be spread to the rest of the world, and they will react with a violence and a hostility unseen. And that's exactly what's been happening. So Russia needs to understand America and the American culture and the American political establishment and the American military is very schizophrenic. It is lacking identity, it has a very weak moral core, and that is precisely the way to communicate in its own information operations, to say Russia is not your enemy, your own politicians are your enemy. Russia doesn't believe in men marrying men or women marrying women, or I think this brochure was written to disorient the American soldier and confuse them and propagandize the American soldier into the false belief that Russia was a menace and a war-clamoring threat to the United States. So the American soldier needs to be prepared to fight in a war against Russia in Ukraine. I think it was based by Obama. It was written under the Obama administration. So their agenda under Obama and Hillary Clinton inevitably was trying to push the Russians out of Ukraine, push the Russians out of Syria, the Middle East, and really strangle them. And this report was preparing that battle space. And of course, the American report analyzed the Russian media. I did a very thorough analysis of the information operations segment, and they very plainly analyzed Russian media, the Russian government, as doing the same things that America is doing, claiming that the Russian government was dominating the information space, that it was using Sputnik and RT and other Russian media platforms as propaganda instruments, whereas the United States is in fact guilty of the same things. The report tried to claim that America has a free information society, government does not meddle with media, and fake news is a Russian tool. But what they didn't report is that the American media is populated and dominated by CIA. The American media and Facebook is actively working to suppress freedom of speech, and YouTube is guilty of this too, by editing and suspending many people who write in the alternative media. So the American oppression of information by the government, by the CIA, by the NSA, by Facebook and their media puppets is very, very apparent. So the Americans are trying to blame and define the Russians based on what the Americans are doing themselves. There's an old adage that says, accuse your enemy of what you yourself are doing. That defines this entire report. They are trying to accuse the Russians of the very things that the United States did. The overthrow of Ukraine with mercenaries and snipers and CIA-backed agents. They tried to say they were Spetsnaz. That's not the case at all. The accusing of Russia as meddling with Syria in a hostile fashion. That was not the case at all. The United States under Saudi Arabia with Israel launched a mercenary invasion of Syria, similar to what they did in Libya, and has tried to overthrow President Bashar Assad. And it is the United States and Israel and Saudi Arabia and the Wahhabi menace that has caused all of the migrants and the refugees to leave and flood into Europe. That is the responsibility of the United States. And we're seeing the fruit of that with Brexit and the change in the German elections. You have a right-wing population rising up because they are tired of migrants and economic refugees from Africa and all these Muslim countries flooding up into Germany and Sweden and engaging in rapes and abuse and all sorts of horrific crimes because they're not culturally assimilated. They're unable to be culturally assimilated because they're not European. All of that is the responsibility of the United States, because we unleashed these wars based on the false flag attacks of 9/11. And all of these wars have sent floods of human refugees up into Europe. Russia can emerge as the savior of Europe by very clearly establishing it is not threatening the European people, it is not looking to expand its real estate or geographic borders, but instead Russia is looking to preserve European Christian values, European liberal values, and defend Europe from the plague of refugees and migrants that the Americans have sent into them. So there's a very big paradigm shift that I think is coming, and this report was very, very, I think, silly and shallow, didn't really address anything of substance. It simply tried to propagandize Russia as a threat, but I think most American military, serving and retired, and anyone who's studied the geopolitical events for the last 5 years understands very clearly that the United States and its reckless military juggernaut that has been working to fight the wars of Israel and the Zionist regime of Netanyahu and the Likud party has caused more destruction in the world than Russia or China or Iran put together. And in fact, the only hope for stabilizing the world is having the coalition of Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Syria, and hopefully more countries in Europe regathering as a coalition of the sane and the responsible to say no more regime change, no more wars. The United States is hereby put on notice the world will not tolerate your recklessness any longer. And that was the other thing about the report. They were trying to accuse the Russians of regime change as an instrument, when in fact the United States has been doing regime change from Saddam Hussein to Afghanistan to Libya and now Syria. So it's a report of propaganda and accusing the Russians of what the United States itself has been doing under Obama. Hopefully Trump will take us in a new direction and stop it.
The most interesting question. But in general, is it possible to imagine that two superpowers will converge, not in a nuclear conversation, but in a direct clashes with each other?
I think that the next conflict will probably be triggered by a American-sponsored action out of Ukraine, simultaneous with a Korean action, simultaneous with a Syrian action. This will be a multi-pronged, US-backed, Israel-backed, coordinated attack or seeming attack against Russia in Ukraine, in Syria, in Korea, in order to create multiple flashpoints, multiple confusion areas for the sake of trying to create a lot of war, clamor, and environment. So, of course, the countermeasures to that need to be the domination of the information space, and the truth and honesty is the best psychological warfare tool. The truth is like a sledgehammer, lies are like a pencil. And the sledgehammer can knock down doors and bridges and knock people into the next room, where a pencil, you know, is shallow and flimsy, and it's not effective. So the United States has been operating with lies and pencils, where the Russians and the rest of the world under Press TV, Iran and China have been using the truth about Syria, the truth about Libya, the truth about Korea, saying that the world does not want a flashpoint, it does not want a war. Korea and China and Russia are not a threat to the United States. Korea is not going to invade Alaska or Hawaii, and neither is Russia going to invade Europe, Britain, Sweden, or any other country. But that is the propaganda that the U.S. has been continuously trying to put out. So there won't be a thermonuclear engagement unless it is set off as a false flag. Of course, let's always remember, since September 11th, 2001, that was the greatest false flag attack that was used against the American public. And that was done by our own government, by our own military, and by our own technological NSA and CIA, and by the Israelis. The Israeli government, of course, let's never forget, attacked the USS Liberty in 1967, in which they tried to bring the United States into the war against Egypt, and that was a false flag that was covered up under Lyndon Johnson. Peter Lavelle and other people have done extensive shows on this, but that is one thing that the American people have been lied to, that Israel engaged in a massive false flag attack against the United States, and it has done so ever since in various episodes, and 9/11 is the greatest one. So the American people need to wake up about who the enemies are, what they've been doing, and it is not Russia, and it is not Iran, and it is not China. It is people in our own deep state and the Zionist neocons who have a religious ideology about dominating the world for democracy and capitalism, which is really a masquerade for resource theft and economic enslavement. So this will be an interesting time. We'll see if the American government sets off a secret nuclear device or some sort of a massive disruption in our own soil to justify militarism. You see that kind of now with the propaganda about NFL football players refusing to kneel, and that is being spun as a propagandistic slogan. So they may try to do something in the United States. They also may try and do a flashpoint where they blame the Russians for some sort of an attack on Ukraine, or blame the Chinese and the Russians and the Koreans for something in Korea, or blame the Russians for another chemical attack in Syria. When you're dealing with liars, which is what the United States under the Obama administration, and sadly continuing under some of the neoconservatives in the Pentagon and the State Department and in the Congress seem to represent, when you're dealing with liars, you always have to be prepared for them to stab you in the back and pull all sorts of false flag attacks out of their repertoire.
Thank you, Scott.
Well, the United States and the Russians certainly need to be closer in their moral alliance and their political alliance and their military alliance, and I think the American people are waking up to that, and will hopefully see that Russia is the closest ally that the American people have.
HSBC had no controls for terrorist financing. They couldn't tell you what one client was doing versus another. Certainly, I think in the UBS case, I think they turned a blind eye to a lot of the things they did, and I have some documents up on the screen, which I'll share with you folks through this process. And it's very compelling, extremely compelling, because it was given to the Department of Justice back in June 19th, 2007, and nothing was done. So that's very important. The essence was that there was a lot more illegal and illicit activity that went on. Here's the document here, and I've got a pointer here to hopefully shoot at it here. Now, what you're seeing here, this is the gentleman's name. This was given to the Department of Justice on this date. There are my initials. That's on June 19th, 07. These are all the numbered accounts this gentleman had. Now, you might say, well, geez, you didn't give up names to the Department of Justice. I didn't, but I was allowed to give up this one. Why? Because he was involved in terrorist financing. And I gave this directly to the Department of Justice, Kevin Downing, and I walked him through why this client was so important. He was making illegal oil sales with Saddam Hussein. I read the whole file in the bank. My boss, his banker, talked everything about this client. And if you read it closely, you can see he's got a code word here. He's got an address here in New York, the 46th and 47th floor, the entire floor of the Olympic Tower, $50 million condo. He's got all these numbered accounts. He's got a password here. He's got a safe deposit box here. His daughter's the power of attorney on it. I knew everything about this client. But when I told him he was a good friend with Rudy Giuliani, he put his hand in his face and told me, we're not interested in non-Americans. I said, really? But you don't understand. He said, we're not interested. At that time, Rudy Giuliani was the front runner for the presidential campaign. So I take it very personally about this card, this piece of information I gave the Department of Justice, Kevin Downing, who committed treason, in my opinion, because nothing was done with this. So we can all sit here and talk about things, but this is so important. Now, if you're not going to follow up on this one, who was $420 million account, so that's the first thing. So what happens here is that you have to look at some of the other serious crimes that exist as a result of lack of transparency and accountability, which is extortion, bribery, insider trading, dictators, and so forth, that use these funds for illegal purposes. And we saw that quite often in Switzerland, and I knew many of the bankers that knew the stories of Marcos's money at Citibank and Gaddafi's money at Pictet and so forth. So it was common knowledge among bankers in closed circles that that was there. And then the second thing is most of the people that worked at Swiss Bancorp and UBS were military folks in the Swiss military. So there was a mindset there, a regimented sense. So I researched this extensively when I was there, and I used to go into the archives at Credit Suisse where I worked, as well as UBS. And I found so many different documents that were so compelling. And it gave me an idea about how this whole system worked. It was part of the culture. By indicting UBS, it'd be like indicting the Swiss government. They're co-conspirators. They're part of it. They're holding hands. I mean, that's very important to understand that. A lot of people might argue with me, but I know I'm right because, quite frankly, you can see what's been going on, especially in the UBS case with the U.S. But I think the problem with UBS was that they did it to such an extent with a level of arrogance, in so much as putting the colleagues and the clients and shareholders at risk, but also thumbing their nose at the U.S. authorities and other authorities in other countries, for that matter. So it was across the board such it was like an organized crime outfit. And I say that quite candidly because this is a publicly listed company. When in fact they get fined, then they write that off as a tax write-off. So the Swiss citizens have to pick up that. Then the shareholders who had nothing to do with it, they lose because the share price drops.